forging a sustainable future. Allow me to share some familiar data. We require 50% reductions of emissions by 2030 to limit warming by 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100. That's the first data. Second data, today, just 8 years away from 2030 target, we are seeing already 1.2 degrees Celsius. And the trajectory is taking us to 2.7 degrees Celsius by 2100. Third data, this disastrous trajectory is putting 800 million people at risk from rising sea level and double that amount to 1.7 billion people experiencing severe heat waves. Imagine a world where we may see 25% loss in total world's GDP by 2100. That is exactly why B20 Indonesia is laser focused to get the global business community to forge a sustainability future today. COP26 in Glasgow, thankfully, has put a temporary break from this slippery slope trend, with some progress through the Glasgow Climate Pact. I'm pleased to co-lead the Indonesian business delegation along with Chairman of Kadin, Pak Arsyad, and B20 Chairwoman Bushinta on our annual mission to the UK, including Glasgow. The COP26 outcomes are not satisfying, but they should leave us hopeful. The summit's Glasgow Pact was short on easy wins. Having said that, we have some progresses. Among others, Article 6, the role of carbon markets. The mobilization of $100 billion per annum from developed economies are key to keep this 1.5 degrees target alive. Indonesia has committed to reach net zero by 2060. Importantly, among the G20 economies, Indonesia has published the most comprehensive roadmap on how to achieve that. Of course, with proper and tangible climate financing, Indonesia can achieve there earlier. Energy transition and net zero is one of the 3 key priorities outlined by President Jokowi, as you have seen today. Hence, as my capacity in the B20 International Advocacy Caucus Group and Chairman of Supervisory Board at Kadin, we collectively will need to take the net zero baton from Glasgow to Bali, where together the business community can amplify our voices via B20. On today's sustainability session, I'm delighted to be joined by the global thought leaders across the globe. First speaker, Mike Bloomberg, founder of Bloomberg, UN Special Envoy for Climate Ambitions and Solutions. Second, Mark Carney, UN Special Envoy on Climate Actions and Finance. Third, Amin Nasser, President and CEO of Saudi Aramco. Fourth, Francesco Staras, CEO of Anal Group. Fifth, Alok Sharma, President of COP26 and Cabinet Minister at Her Majesty Government. And sixth, Andrew Forrest, Chairman and Founder of Fortescue Future Industry. Now, our first speaker. I had the great pleasure in meeting Mike on the first day of COP26 in Glasgow. It has been a great pleasure to have Mike to join our B20 International Advocacy Caucus to drive the sustainability transition topic and potentially collaborating in bringing the first Bloomberg Summit to Southeast Asia in Bali in the same week of B20 and G20. Without further ado, I'll invite Mike to share his insights on how global business community can work together to tackle the reality of climate disasters.
Hello, everyone. It has been a very challenging start to the year, and I hope you're all well. I want to thank the B20 and our hosts in Indonesia for bringing us together. The fact is, all the big challenges we face require collaboration across borders and across the public and private sectors. That's true about the pandemic and about climate change. Businesses have strong incentives to help lead the way. Climate change presents enormous financial risks, and the transition to clean energy is an enormous investment opportunity. Bloomberg and Bloomberg Philanthropies are working closely with Indonesia to speed up investment in green infrastructure and to knock down barriers that stand in the way. We developed a roadmap for ramping up solar power in Indonesia and worked with its infrastructure bank to help get projects off the ground. And globally, we're leading a number of efforts to help businesses identify the risks and opportunities they face from climate change so that they can take action. Just to name one, we're leading the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD as it's called. A growing number of countries have endorsed the TCFD's recommendations, including the G20 countries. It's a great example of how businesses and governments can work together. The B20 plays an important role in spurring more of these collaborations. So thank you all for bringing your insights and expertise to this conference, and all the best.
Thank you, Mike, for sharing these top-of-the-house issues, and a round of applause from Jakarta, indeed. As climate change presents immense financial risk, and transition to clean energy presents an enormous investment opportunity, businesses have strong incentives to help carve the path. Next, we will explore a live topic on carbon markets, a key priority for Indonesia and many other emerging economies to develop an active and liquid carbon markets. Now, I will bring in Mark, who will share his perspective on how to accelerate carbon market ecosystem worldwide. Please, Mark Carney.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be joining you virtually. I wish I was there in person, and I certainly intend to be in Indonesia over the course of the year. Let me provide a few words of context and then hit on carbon markets. And the big picture is that I believe that Indonesia's G20 presidency can be decisive in unlocking the power of the private sector to tackle the climate crisis. Under the presidency of Alex Sharma, from whom you'll hear in a few moments, the proportion of emissions covered by country net zero targets rose from less than 1/3 to more than 80%. And net zero is now the organizing principle for over 5,000 of the world's largest companies. And with the right policies in the right markets, such as carbon markets, it will become the norm throughout our economies and will drive major cross-border financial flows. And the second big point I'd like to make is that the money needed, the enormous amount of money that is needed to finance the net zero transition, is now available. That's because in Glasgow, 24 major reforms to the heart of the financial system were delivered to align it with the net zero transition, including global standards for mandatory climate disclosure, building on what Mike Bloomberg just referenced, the TCFD, endorsed by Indonesia and other major emerging economies through something called the new ISSB. In parallel, GFANZ, which is a group of over 450 of the world's largest banks, asset managers, insurers, and pension funds from over 45 countries, committed to manage their $130 trillion balance sheets in line with net zero. That's 40% of all global financial assets. It's the kind of financial firepower needed to address the scale of the global energy transition. Now, there's three ways to seize the opportunity that has been created in Glasgow. The first is with credible and predictable country policies. The more government climate policies are credible and predictable, the more investors will pour money in anticipation of changes driving large-scale investment, faster decarbonization, more jobs, and greater growth. And the B20 can reinforce the calls of GFANZ for more ambitious policy measures, including carbon pricing, the development of carbon markets, deep decarbonization policies to transform industries like transportation, and mandatory net zero transition plans for large companies. The world also needs more clarity on the energy transition, and I'm sure Amin Nasser will expand on this, including frameworks for responsible retirement of stranded assets, the financing of low carbon intensity fossil fuels during the transition, and the acceleration of new low carbon generation. The G20 can drive the consensus and the action on all these issues. The second big initiative I would recommend for this G20 is to ensure that emerging economies can receive the additional $1 trillion a year of financing they need for the transition. And to get there, we're going to need reform of the international financial architecture. Specifically, that means new country platforms which combine ambitious country climate plans, that GFAN's financing, catalytic initiatives such as the CFLI, which Mike Bloomberg's leading, including in Indonesia, and the expertise and capital of multilateral development banks. These platforms should deploy new structures of blended finance with high multipliers, connecting private finance with Paris-aligned projects and managing the wind down of stranded assets. And third, we need high-integrity voluntary carbon markets. These markets could expand the world's limited carbon budget by over 10%. The Glasgow Climate Pact critically concluded Article 6, which will help facilitate government-to-government flows for carbon markets. But the largest flows won't come from governments. This will be capital from those companies in advanced economies who've committed to net zero. Capital from these companies to projects in the emerging and developing world, including nature-based solutions such as reforestation that not just reduce carbon, but help tackle the crisis in biodiversity. The right infrastructure is now in prospect to grow this market to over $100 billion a year. The Winners Task Force published its blueprint, and a new governance body, the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, is now overseeing the development of market standards, including assurance both on the quality of credits by setting out new core carbon principles and ensuring that credits deliver real, permanent, and additional emissions reductions. And I'd encourage both the B20 and the G20 to endorse these core carbon principles and for governments to help put in place the necessary market and regulatory infrastructure to accelerate the development of these essential carbon markets. To conclude, the last time I was in Indonesia was a few years ago in Bali. And at that point, the president correctly, this was the IMF annual meetings, and the president correctly warned us that winter is coming. Now, I'd suggest by seizing the opportunities created in Glasgow and by this new financial system, Indonesia's presidency has the potential not just to mark the change of seasons, but to change the climate to the benefit of our fellow citizens today and generations to come. Thank you very much.
Let's give it up for Mark. Thanks, Mark, for your invaluable knowledge in accelerating the carbon market ecosystem worldwide and how Indonesia can play an active role in this space. Especially, Indonesia is known as the world's lung, as over 50% of Indonesia's land mass are covered by forestry. 96 million hectares of forests, mangroves, and peatlands. This will be a fundamental element to propel Indonesia and G20 countries' net zero transition stories. As we are in transition era, we need to acknowledge that companies in the energy and resources sector will be heavily impacted and poised to be active participants of carbon markets. Now, it is a great segue to invite Mr. Amin Nasser, President and CEO of Saudi Aramco, to share his perspectives on a just transition in energy sector in the post-pandemic era. Perspectives from the chief of the largest company in the world by revenue will set the tone on how other business leaders are looking at this transition story. Over to you, Mr. Amin Nasser.
Good evening from Saudi Arabia, and thank you, Dr. Anin. As you and Mark have just outlined, forging a sustainable future is among the most urgent tasks in front of us now, and it is one of the greatest responsibilities we have to our future generations. Energy transition is important to reach that future. And to reliably move towards a sustainable future, we must focus on both economic development and climate protection. Because, as we all know, energy is the lifeblood of modern economies and societies. To ensure economic development, reliable, affordable, and sustainable energy is required. And we all agree that to move toward a sustainable energy future, a smooth energy transition is absolutely essential. But we must also consider the complexities and challenges to get there. Strategies and actions need to be pragmatic, just, and inclusive. Although we have to acknowledge that the current transition is not going smoothly. A one-size-fits-all approach is having painful consequences, proving that it's unlikely to equally work for developed and developing countries. As the global economy has started to recover, there has been a resurgence in demand for oil and gas. But since investment in oil and gas have fallen, supplies have lagged, which is why we see very tight markets in Europe and part of Asia. And the COVID pandemic has only widened the gap between the have and have-nots, with severe implications for economies, societies, and billions of people around the world. For example, technology solutions that industrialized or developed countries can afford are out of reach for developing countries. And McKinsey Global Institute predicted this week that roughly $275 trillion would need to be spent globally on physical assets by 2050. But clearly, alternatives are not yet ready to shoulder the burden of large and growing global energy demand. So demand for conventional energy is likely to prevail for quite some time. Unfortunately, supplies of conventional energy are being discouraged, while alternatives are not yet ready, be it for heavy transport, to chemicals or lubricants. Even in light duty vehicles, where electric vehicles offer an option, really clean electricity will not be available for quite some time, especially in the developing world. So in my view, the transition plan needs to reflect these realities, which point to the need for both existing and new energy running in parallel. And a failure to revise transition plan and strategy will be seriously harmful for billions of people and the global economy. But let me be clear, this is not about changing climate goals or that investment in a new energy be stopped. What I am proposing is that investment in both existing and new energy be continued until the latter is developed enough to realistically and significantly be able to meet rising global energy consumption. And to advance progress on the climate goals, we need to intensify effort to further lighten the carbon footprint of conventional energy. It is to be recognized that concurrently accomplishing all the goals I have highlighted is a tough challenge. But I am confident that with the energy industry governments in both the developed and developing world and society working together, we can plan better and accomplish our goals. Thank you for your attention, and I wish President Joko Widodo and all our friends in Indonesia a successful G20 presidency. Thank you.
A round of applause for Mr. Nasser. His take on ensuring a just transition in the energy sector in the post-pandemic era is certainly nice to see coming from the Middle East region. Now, let's go to the mainland Europe, where we want to hear some deep dives on net zero journey from one of Europe's largest utility company by market cap, and a leading Italian multinational manufacturer and distributor of electricity and gas, Enel Group. I want to invite Francesco Staras, CEO of Enel Group, on how companies around G20 economies can catalyze that net zero transition to forge a sustainable future. The floor is yours, Francesco.
Thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be here with you. I had the honor of chairing the task force and resource efficiency on the last B20 that was headed by Italy, as the G20 was presidency was the Italian one. And we have spent considerable amount of time trying to reconcile different positions, as obvious during this so critical and so important transition. We basically distilled 4 major recommendations in order to accelerate and make sure that the transition is an orderly one and not a turbulent one, as we have seen many other transitions of technological nature becoming in the past. I would add that major industrial-driven, technologically driven transition have been great enablers of progress for mankind in the past, but also they have brought about and generated a lot of inequality. Invariably, this has happened all the times. We have a chance now to try and bring about the inevitable energy transition without the same amount of inequality that previous industrial transition have generated in the past. And we think that if we follow 4 guidelines, we might have a chance of doing that. The first one is clearly, this is a transition that is beneficial for everybody. It's beneficial for the industrial progress of mankind. It's beneficial for the social progress of mankind. It's also beneficial for climate, and it is a major tool to fight climate change. So it should be accelerated, and we should shift energy users toward clean energy, promoting and accelerating the shift to clean energy sources, namely promoting electrification, being electricity progressively decarbonized, and moving to other energy sources that do not have greenhouse gas emissions associated with that. We have in parallel to increase the efficiency, so the efficient use of energy, which today is not correctly considered in many energy policies around the world, and in parallel, a monumental task is in front of us, which is develop infrastructures that are capable of sustaining this ambition and this effort. I'm talking about investments in the range of trillions, roughly about 9 trillions a year in the next 10 years, in order to really go through this properly. The second is to provide policies to further, to foster growth of a sustainable manner. So we have to leverage the great tool of sustainable finance. There is a great appetite from financial community for investment opportunities that have that are directly tied, connected to the Sustainable Development Goals. So make sure that finance is tackled in the right direction, and make sure that we have what in the COP26, and I think this has been one of the great accomplishments of the COP26, develop carbon markets that will eventually converge to a single market. It's not possible to do it from the onset, but develop different carbon markets is already a big step towards decarbonizing deeply our society. The third is make sure that we have a resilient and robust supply chain system. I think what we have learned during the COVID-19 is that the supply chains we were used to have were fragile and extremely fragmented, and we are still paying the price for that. The present supply chain disruptions that we are all facing in different parts of the world are the result of some kind of lack of attention to the dimension of global trade, and what we need to do is to really rethink the way in which logistics and in general manufacturing and consumption locations have to be considered in a different way and more with consideration of resiliency, not just cost efficiency. I think we have heard directly from Mr. Nasser the importance of the transition to be just. And this is a key point. This is something that we need to understand. The resistance to the transition will be directly proportional to our lack of attention to those that sit in part of the industrial development that are going to be directly affected negatively, I would say, from this transition. So let's make sure that they are part of the benefits of the transition and not just subject to some